Just a couple months ago, Francis Ngannou was on top of the world. He was the UFC heavyweight champion, he was getting paid millions by the UFC and his sponsors, and he was getting called out by the best heavyweight boxers in the world for potential super fights. But now, he's no longer the heavyweight champion, he's been banned from fighting in the UFC according to Dana White, and the top boxers that he planned on fighting seem to have completely forgotten about him. So in this video, I want to talk about just how bad the Francis Ngannou situation is, and the three main ways that I see this playing out for him. And if you haven't already, be sure to head over to UFCBettingPro.com, the link is in the description, so you can get UFC bets and breakdowns sent directly to you for every UFC card. And you can even watch UFC with me and the community live on voice chat. So stop wasting hours of your time researching and losing money betting on UFC and start winning. Matter of fact, just last weekend, our members won big on Jon Jones by submission, Rakhmonov versus Neal over 1 round, and Mateusz Gamrot moneyline, just to name a few plays that we gave out for the card. But anyway, let's get into the video. It all started on April 23rd, 2022. After Ngannou had just retained his heavyweight title in his fight against Ciryl Gane just 4 months prior, Francis Ngannou was invited into the ring after heavyweight boxing champion Tyson Fury had just defended his title against Dillian Whyte. And in his post-fight interview, Tyson Fury claimed that he wanted to fight Francis Ngannou in a potential boxing super fight. And you can literally see the dollar signs in Ngannou's eyes when he realizes that he would make much more in this fight alone than his entire UFC career combined. This would be the chance to launch him into superstardom, just like the Mayweather versus McGregor fight did for Conor McGregor. But there's just one problem: Dana White. You see, Dana and Francis were already having issues with the negotiation of his current contract leading up to his fight with Ciryl Gane. Now that he had retained his title by beating Ciryl Gane, he'd be locked in with the UFC for another whole year, and there was just no way that Dana would let Francis stall the UFC heavyweight division for another whole year by training and fighting in a boxing super fight. And as tensions rose between Francis's team and Dana White, the next thing you know, the UFC had officially lost the baddest man on the planet. And while initially Francis thought that this was no big deal as he could proceed with the boxing super fights that he had lined up for him, Dana White had other plans. See, every time that the UFC loses a star, Dana White does whatever he can to spit on and squander their name to make sure that they don't draw too much attention away from the UFC and to whatever organization that they decide to move to. And to take away their negotiating power by making it public that the UFC will no longer be working with them to ensure that they don't have the leverage to negotiate for more money in their next fights and contracts. And unfortunately, it's working. Shortly after Francis Ngannou was released from the UFC, Dana White has been out on a full media campaign just to spoil Francis Ngannou's name at any chance that he gets. From saying that he's not a big enough draw, to saying that he's just too scared to fight Jon Jones and so he's running. This is quite literally a cardio kickboxing coach from Boston saying that the baddest man on the planet is too scared to fight. And this is while all the public receipts are available to you online that Francis Ngannou has been calling out Jon Jones for the last 3 years. And mind you, this is the exact same strategy that Dana White used to justify releasing Cris Cyborg, by saying that she was just too scared to rematch Amanda Nunes and making it public that the UFC would never work with her again. Once again to lower her stock as she proceeded to move on to another organization. But this is where the problems start to arise for Francis. While Francis was under the impression that heavyweight boxing stars like Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury were ready to make the super fight happen once he had stepped away from the UFC, ever since he was publicly released from the UFC and stripped of his title, both Wilder and Fury have gone completely silent. Unfortunately for Francis, now that he's not the UFC heavyweight champion, boxers just don't want to fight him as much anymore, since they can't promote it as the UFC heavyweight champion versus the boxing heavyweight champion. Because you have to understand, practically everyone in boxing has a belt, considering there's like 30 organizations and 30 different weight classes in each of them. And so a fight with someone that has no active belt in boxing is just much harder to promote, especially if you're not a social media star or a huge draw like Conor McGregor. Literally, even in the Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury fight, they presented the winner with a made-up belt from God knows what organization. Just think about that for a second. They presented Tommy Fury with a boxing title for beating Jake Paul, a YouTuber. That pretty much sums up boxing for you. Matter of fact, Francis Ngannou isn't even a UFC fighter anymore, and the idea that he's the baddest man on the planet has a huge asterisk on it, considering how dominantly Jon Jones has just defeated Ciryl Gane, who of course had a very close fight with Francis Ngannou when they matched up back in 2022, in which Francis Ngannou barely won in a 5-round decision. And with Francis Ngannou no longer being a UFC heavyweight champion star, the Francis Ngannou matchup just wouldn't draw as many pay-per-view buys as it would have shortly after he defended his title back in 2022 when Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder were actually calling him out. So the smaller payday that would come with fighting Francis Ngannou, who's not an active champion and not as known in the boxing community, would just not justify the risk, regardless of how small or big it is, of potentially getting knocked out by a career-ending shot from Francis Ngannou in the boxing ring. That's the plain truth. The reward just no longer justifies the risk for these boxers whose relatively spotless and inflated records are just too precious for their personal brand and earning power. And so the sad reality is the potential boxing super fights that Francis Ngannou had thrown away his UFC career for have essentially vanished into thin air. But after everything I said, the worst part is, as long as Francis is banned from the UFC and has no potential massive fights lined up for him, his stock will continue to go down as he's out of the limelight with no stars calling him out, and Dana White and Jon Jones continuing to squander his name as the scared guy who ran away every time his name is brought up in an interview. Literally, as every day passes with no fights or contracts on the horizon for Francis, it's only going to get harder for Francis to negotiate and get the fights and contracts that he really wants. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There are 3 ways that I see this playing out for Francis Ngannou when all is said and done. The first is seemingly the worst option out of the 3. It's that he signs with the lesser MMA organization like PFL or Bellator. And while us fans would still be very happy to see him fighting in MMA at the very least, the fact is he would make much less than he did in the UFC, and he would most likely just be crushing cans, as most stars usually do in these smaller organizations, just like Chris Cyborg still is to this day. Someone who was once the scariest fighter in women's MMA has faded out of the limelight and has just been crushing cans for a fraction of the revenue over in Bellator. And I think it would just be sad to see Francis Ngannou do the same when he has so much time to solidify his legacy as one of the greatest heavyweights ever if he stayed in the UFC. The second outcome is probably the best for Francis Ngannou's wallet, and it's that one of the top heavyweight boxers had a change of heart and actually went through with their fight with Francis Ngannou. And honestly, this will always be a possibility considering how often boxing matchups fall through, and so it's definitely possible that one of these boxers could end up actually biting the bullet and taking this fight with Francis. And even though I think both Wilder and Fury would be very tough matchups for Francis Ngannou in the 12-round world of boxing, even if Francis lost, it would still be worth everything that he risked just to get the fight and the payday. This third option is what's best for us fans and what I'm personally hoping for more than any of the other outcomes. It's that Jon Jones, either out of the kindness of his heart or from realizing that he'll just never be the undisputed heavyweight champion without it, officially calls out Francis Ngannou and makes it known that he actually wants to set up the fight with him. I think if later down the line Jon Jones actually goes through with this and Francis Ngannou doesn't overplay his hand in the negotiation, Dana White will have to oblige and actually make this fight happen. And I don't care if Dana White said that he'll never have Francis Ngannou back in the UFC. You have to realize just how many times Dana White said something would never happen, only to go back on what he said once he realized the money was there to be made. Just like when he said that the UFC would never have women's MMA fighters.
When are we gonna see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Never? Never.
And did exactly the opposite of that just a couple years later. And you have to understand that Dana White would absolutely make this fight happen if his poster boy Jon Jones insisted on it. Overall, whatever Francis Ngannou ends up doing, I hope more than anything that we get to see him fight again and that he gets what he's been looking for. Because the fact is, Francis Ngannou is one of the most genuine athletes that I've ever seen step into the octagon. And even though him and his team may have overplayed their hand in their negotiations with Dana White in the UFC, his career is far from over and I wish him the best wherever he goes. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to watch these 2 videos right here and I guarantee you'll enjoy them as well. But anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next video.